The night Hungary chose its fate did not feel like history being made. It felt like a country holding its breath while boots echoed in dark corridors and men in tailored uniforms lied to themselves about survival. Because no nation willingly walks into disaster. It drifts there step by step, wrapped in pride, fear, and the illusion that obedience might buy mercy. And in 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed into dust, Hungary woke up smaller, humiliated, and bleeding from a wound that never closed. The Treaty of Trianon carving away 2/3 of its land like a public execution, leaving behind a nation obsessed with maps, borders, and revenge. Children growing up memorizing lost cities the way others memorized prayers. Men staring at atlases as if staring long enough might reverse time. And this obsession became Hungary's compass, its curse, and eventually its chain. Because when Germany rose again under Hitler promising revision, restoration, and revenge against the same powers that had humiliated Hungary, it did not arrive as a conqueror, but as a tempting ally. Smiling, speaking of justice, whispering that history could be undone. And Regent Miklos Horthy, an admiral without a navy ruling a landlocked country, stood at the center of this contradiction, a conservative nationalist who despised Bolshevism, distrusted democracy, feared Germany, yet needed it. Because Hungary wanted its lands back, and Germany was the only power willing to hand them over, piece by piece. First, southern Slovakia, then parts of Transylvania, each territorial gain celebrated like a miracle, each one tightening the rope. Because gifts from predators are never free. And while flags waved and crowds cheered, laws quietly hardened. Anti-Semitic restrictions crept into daily life, not yet genocidal, but unmistakably poisonous. Jews pushed out of professions, out of universities, out of the national we. All justified as alignment with a new Europe, a disciplined Europe, a strong Europe. And when war broke out in 1939, Hungary hesitated, officially neutral, unofficially leaning, watching Poland burn while refugees crossed its borders and were quietly helped despite German pressure, proving Hungary was not yet fully lost. But neutrality is a fragile lie when geography traps you. And by 1941, the illusion shattered. As German troops demanded passage, Yugoslavia collapsed overnight, and Hungary joined the invasion, telling itself it was reclaiming rightful land, not participating in conquest. And then came the decision that sealed everything, sending the Hungarian Second Army to the Eastern Front, under-equipped, poorly trained, dressed in thin coats against Russian winter, marched into a war they did not understand for an ally that did not respect them. And at the Don River in 1942-43, Hungary's dream froze to death. Soviet artillery tore through positions, temperatures dropped below human tolerance, soldiers burned furniture to stay alive, fingers snapped off like glass, entire units vanished. And when the Red Army counterattacked, it was not a battle, it was an erasure. Over 200,000 Hungarians killed, wounded, or captured, a national trauma buried under propaganda, but felt in every village when sons did not return. And from that frozen hell, Hungary learned the truth too late. Germany would not protect it. Germany would consume it. And Horthy tried to turn back, secretly negotiating with the Allies, desperately seeking an exit, but history does not forgive hesitation. And in March 1944, German tanks rolled into Budapest in Operation Marguerite, not as guests, but as jailers. And Hungary lost what little sovereignty it had left without a single shot fired, because fear had already disarmed it. And this is where the story turns darkest, because occupation unlocked the machinery of annihilation. Adolf Eichmann arrived with lists, trains, schedules, and within weeks, Hungarian Jews were rounded up with terrifying efficiency, not by Germans alone, but by Hungarian gendarmes, neighbors, officials. The banality of evil wearing familiar faces. Entire communities erased in months. Auschwitz filling with Hungarian transports faster than crematoria could process them.
And Budapest remained a strange island of delay only because Horthy finally drew a line, halting deportations in July 1944, an act that saved lives but could not erase what had already been done. And Germany responded the only way it knew how, by replacing hesitation with terror, backing the Arrow Cross, Hungary's own fascist nightmare, who dragged Jews to the Danube, shot them into freezing water, and turned the capital into a slaughterhouse, while Soviet forces closed in from the east. And Hungary, the nation that had tried to play history like a chessboard, found itself crushed between two monsters, one retreating, one advancing, neither merciful. And as Budapest became a battlefield, civilians hid in basements while shells collapsed churches and palaces alike, the siege lasting months, starvation setting in, horses slaughtered for meat, children learning the sound of artillery before learning multiplication. And when the Red Army finally took the city in early 1945, it did not feel like liberation to many. It felt like survival at an unbearable cost. Because rape, revenge, and retribution followed. And Hungary's war ended not with triumph or clarity, but with exhaustion, guilt, and silence. A country alive but hollow, forced into the Soviet sphere, its wartime choices now rewritten by victors, its sins exaggerated, its suffering minimized, its complexity erased. And this is the real Hungarian World War II story. Not heroism, not pure villainy, but a small nation making flawed choices under impossible pressure, trying to survive in a century that punished hesitation as brutally as aggression.
After the Don River disaster, Hungary stopped believing in German victory, but kept pretending it still did, because admitting the truth meant admitting the country had bet its future on the wrong empire. Villages filled with widows before newspapers admitted defeat. Officers returned hollow-eyed, medals meaningless against frostbite scars. And behind closed doors, Budapest elites whispered the same question again and again. How do we get out without being crushed? But history had already accelerated beyond whispers, because Germany sensed the doubt, and doubt was treason. And when Hungary hesitated to fully commit in 1943, Berlin stopped negotiating and started planning, seeing Hungary not as a partner, but as a corridor, a resource pool, a buffer zone to be drained dry. And while Horthy tried to balance between resistance and submission, anti-Semitic laws tightened further. Labor battalions swallowed Jewish men by the tens of thousands, sent to the front without weapons, worked to death under Hungarian command, proving that brutality did not arrive suddenly in 1944. It had been growing quietly for years, normalized step by step, until cruelty felt administrative. And when Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944, it wasn't chaos, it was efficiency. Trains ran on time, lists were ready, local police cooperated, and in less than 2 months, provincial Jewish life that had existed for centuries was erased almost completely, not in riots, not in panic, but in lines, stamps, and signatures. Families told they were being relocated, neighbors watching in silence, some out of fear, some out of relief, some out of greed. And this speed is what makes Hungary's Holocaust uniquely horrifying, because it exposed how thin the line was between normal society and industrial murder. And when Budapest was finally spared temporarily, it wasn't morality that intervened, it was geopolitics, Allied bombings, international pressure, and Horthy's late realization that history would remember him not as a survivor, but as a collaborator. And that pause saved lives but sealed his fate, because Germany responded by unleashing the Arrow Cross, men who didn't need orders to kill, who enjoyed it, who turned ideology into street-level terror. And from that moment, Hungary was no longer sliding toward catastrophe, it was free-falling into it. By the winter of 1944, Budapest was no longer a capital, it was a trap.
Surrounded, starved, and slowly pulverized, the Danube frozen, bridges shattered, streets buried under rubble and corpses alike, civilians hiding in cellars counting shells instead of hours, learning which walls shook before collapsing, which sounds meant artillery and which meant death squads. Because the arrow cross still roamed even as the city died, dragging people from safe houses, marching them to the river, bullets cracking through night fog, bodies disappearing beneath black water, while German and Hungarian soldiers dug in among civilians, turning apartment blocks into fortresses, knowing relief would never come, but fighting anyway, because surrender meant execution or Siberia. And when the Red Army finally broke through in February 1945, there was no cheering, only exhaustion, because liberation arrived wearing boots stained with vengeance, looting, mass rape, and summary justice, a different terror replacing the old one without pause. And for ordinary Hungarians, survival became moral silence. Keep your head down, say nothing, remember everything. Because the war ended on paper, but continued in memory, and the city that emerged was alive only because it had learned how to endure.
When the guns finally fell silent, Hungary didn't get peace, it got rearranged. Power shifting hands without asking permission, Soviet commanders deciding who was guilty, who was useful, who would vanish, and the irony burned deep because many who had served Germany were punished loudly, while others quietly reinvented themselves overnight. Uniforms replaced with party cards, collaborators calling themselves victims, victims forced to prove their innocence. And the narrative hardened fast, because under communist rule, Hungary's war was no longer a tragedy of choices, but a simple morality play, where fascists were evil, communists were saviors, and anything in between was erased. Jewish suffering acknowledged only when it served ideology, national suffering dismissed as reactionary whining, and the population learned a new survival skill: selective memory. Say what the state wants, think what you must in private, because prisons filled quickly with those who talked too honestly, and landowners, officers, priests, anyone labeled unreliable were removed to make room for the new order, while Soviet troops stayed, not as guests, but as guarantors, ensuring Hungary would never drift again. And by the late 1940s, the country that had tried to escape empires now belonged fully to one. Its WW2 story frozen in official textbooks, flattened, simplified, and weaponized, teaching generations not what happened, but what was permitted to be remembered. Guilt in post-war Hungary was never clean. It was layered, uneven, and deeply political, because the men who froze at the dawn were not the men who signed deportation orders. The civilians who hid neighbors were not the same ones who pointed them out. Yet the system punished categories, not conscience, and this created a quiet resentment that poisoned memory for decades. Families knowing their suffering would never be officially acknowledged because it didn't fit the approved script, while Jewish survivors returned to empty homes, looted apartments, hostile stares, realizing survival itself had made them inconvenient witnesses. And this mutual silence fractured society, each group carrying trauma but forbidden to speak it fully. And the state filled that silence with slogans, turning WWII into a cautionary tale about fascism, while avoiding harder questions about collaboration, cowardice, and moral choice, because asking those questions would mean admitting that ordinary people, not monsters, had made the system work. And when 1956 erupted, it wasn't just about Soviet tanks. It was about a nation that had been forced to lie about itself since the war. And the failure of that uprising sealed the lesson. History would remain dangerous, memory would remain controlled, and Hungary would carry WWII like an unhealed bone, functional enough to walk, painful enough to never forget. Inside homes, Hungary remembered a different war than the one taught in schools. Grandparents spoke in fragments, half sentences cut short by habit and fear, stories told at night and never written down, about Russian soldiers taken prisoner and never seen again, about Jewish classmates who vanished between terms, about fathers who came back silent or didn't come back at all. And these private memories didn't align with official ones, so they stayed private, turning history into something intimate and unstable, passed orally like a warning rather than a lesson. And after 1989, when the archives opened and censorship collapsed, the country didn't suddenly agree, it splintered, because truth arrived all at once, messy and contradictory, forcing Hungarians to face a past that had been flattened for 40 years. And instead of healing, WW2 became a battlefield again, this time in politics, where victimhood and responsibility were traded like weapons, each side choosing which dead to mourn and which to ignore. And this selective remembrance revealed the war's final damage. It didn't just destroy lives, it broke the nation's ability to agree on itself, leaving Hungary still arguing with 1944 while the rest of the world moved on. Hungary's Second World War did not end in 1945, it simply stopped killing at the same speed, because wars truly end only when nations accept what they did, why they did it, and who paid the price. And Hungary has spent decades circling those questions without landing, trapped between seeing itself as a victim of empires and confronting the moments it chose convenience over courage, obedience over resistance, and survival over orality. And the tragedy is not that Hungary was small or weak, it is that it believed cleverness could replace principle, that aligning with power could undo injustice without creating new crimes. And history proved otherwise, because the land regained was temporary, the guilt permanent, the trauma inherited. And today, when Hungarians argue about statues, memorials, and names, they are not arguing about the past. They are arguing about identity, about whether a nation can admit it was both harmed and responsible, both crushed and complicit. And this is the final uncomfortable truth of Hungary in World War II. It was not uniquely evil, not uniquely innocent, just human under extreme pressure. And history's harshest judgment is not reserved for monsters, but for ordinary societies that convince themselves there was no other choice.